Okay. Hello and welcome. I think we are one of the last sessions, at least for us it's the last session
Yes.
of this very crowded conference. I think in overall I had 6 or 7, you had 3?
That's my, yes.
3?
It's the third one.
Enough talking, plus everything else. So, what do we have prepared for you for at least our final VMTN session today? We are going to talk about what to not ignore when you are ever going to do a VMware Cloud Director design. I think I should have potentially somewhere in my life started making a list of how many VCD designs I did over the years. It's definitely more than 100. We are going to guide you through that a bit about what are the things you should watch out for, what are the things you should actually avoid, what are the things you should be very careful. First, to myself, I'm Yves Sandfort, partner and CEO of the Comdivision Group. I even made a VCDX in this wonderful Cloud Director world, so I made a VCDX on VRA and VCD in combination. Wonderful experience. If you ever want to harm yourself, then go down that pathways. Otherwise, only do a VCDX on one product. That helps you quite a bit. I'm actually responsible also for the majority of our service providers, customers, and take the lead on that one. And with that, I'm handing over to Sasha.
Yes, hello from my side, Sascha Schwunk. I'm a partner at Comdivision, working with Cloud Director, especially with the NSXT, ALB stuff and the ZSE stuff, and the complete design together with the complete Comdivision team. And we have done so many installations in the last months and years with Cloud Director, and we have learned much about the design of Cloud Director. What are the do's and don'ts? And that is the point we want to talk and speak about this today.
So just real quick, how do we normally qualify or run our projects, just to give you a bit of a background. So there is basically no project which doesn't start off with an architecture phase. We then have knowledge transfer, and that's very important when we talk about things like Cloud Director and things like that. As easy as the solution sometimes looks, it's not necessarily that you need to know what you can do, but it's sometimes even more important the things which you shouldn't do. It's like how many service providers we had over the years where we had to re-implement everything 2 or 3 times because some people thought they were very, very clever in actually messing around in the infrastructure or do other things. That is something you can avoid, which is especially very harmful if at the same point in time you have already hundreds of production customers on that infrastructure. And okay, where's the last one? Oh, there's the last one. And then finally, operations. So that's the other part where we help most service providers, especially when they are new in VCD. It's not only about design implementation, but very often we also come in and guardrail for the first couple of weeks or months as the operations team so that they know how to best support customers, how to solve special cases, how to design customer pieces and stuff like that. So starting to speak about the design, what's the worst idea about the design? Not having one.
Not having it, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the point. It's like implementing VCD. VMware has so many applications by now, whether it's VCD or many of the other applications. Implementing it without having a proper design and without understanding what you do there, is definitely the worst you can do. Let me give you just one example of a customer or of a service provider where we dealt with. They also did the usual thing. They went to the VMware webpage, downloaded the appliance, deployed 3 appliances, so at least they were clever enough to figure out how to solve HA. They implemented vSphere, vSAN, NSX, but at one point in time they didn't know how to cross-link NSX into VCD. They came to us because they needed an upgrade of certain services, and they were wondering why these upgrades didn't work. We figured out that actually that connection in one certain part was missing. End of the story, 250 customers had to be manually migrated into a completely new completely new environment because of one little checkbox which was missed in the initial deployment. So let's try to avoid these things, and the main way on how to avoid these things is not only having the knowledge but also having a proper design in place in the first place. I'm not sure if the clicker is. So when we talk about designing a VMware Cloud Director scenario, there are multiple areas which we need to cover from a design perspective. You want to cover 1 or 2 of them already?
Yeah, we want to start with the infrastructure. So it's very important to have a design of the infrastructure. Talking about, we need a management cluster. What network connectivity do we need? What storage do we need for this? And we want to go, when we start now, we are starting with NSXT, so it's the next big stuff with the network. So how should the network look? It's a completely other design like in an enterprise environment or in an on-prem environment as a customer. So make sure we have a good network design, talking about the networks. How should the customer connect to the Cloud Director? That's one point. The other point, how does the networks look like when we are talking about tenants? So do you have a direct connection from the customer? Do we need VPN connections? How should the internet connection work? Do we going with NAT or do we have an MPLS at your side connect to the customer? Do we have other services located in your data center that we need to connect with the services in the tenant?
Yeah, so speaking especially around the networking piece, one of the biggest difference between most of the commercial and enterprise implementations and VCD from that perspective is clearly how you are going to build your tier 0, tier 1 routing, how we build dynamic routing into that and all of that. That is typically where most people run into the biggest mistakes, because the way on how you deploy something for just one customer is in many cases completely different than what we would do in the service provider environment. There is, for example, barely none of the latest deployments which we have done, which does not at least involve BGP and VRF, because there is barely no design on how you can do that, which also means if you are going to design any of these platforms, you need to know and understand how BGP works, how VRF Lite works, how you integrate them. As we will potentially come later to CSE and Tanzu, that also means you need to understand how AVI and ALB is going to be designed. So there are a lot of little bits and pieces where it is very easily overlooked and where it definitely makes sense to have a closer discussion and look into that. But it's not only that. You need to, when you design for a Cloud Director environment, one of the things you also need to always consider is, are we going to do any automation? So what do we need from an extensibility perspective? Are there any additional services like VCDA and a few other things? We will cover them later on as well. And do we need any third-party integrations? Might be a good idea that your customers get a backup solution for their VMs or something like that. I know it's a bizarre concept. We have snapshots and could use them, but ideally we want to have real backups and solutions integrated. So all of this needs to be covered from a perspective. At least the bare minimum are the top two things. So you need to have a clear understanding on how you're going to design your infrastructure and your network. And all of that needs to be very, very clear before we even start the VCD design. If you first do your VCD design and then figure out how you build your infrastructure, good luck. I can more or less tell you that's going to dramatically fail. So speaking about infrastructure, there are a few things which we need to consider. So clearly we have vSphere underlying. I must say vSphere underlying, yes, that's still the case in most cases, in most scenarios, but VCD, if you haven't seen the announcements lately, VCD now even allows you to plug in things like EC2 instances on AWS and other things. So here VCD will go out and actually manage other clouds in the future moving forward. And that is a completely different ballgame, and we will not go into this one. But when we look into vSpheres, so what would be the cluster size you would say you would go for initially?
Yeah, 48.
Damn, was too quick. No, so why 48? We can do 64 from that perspective.
Yeah, the problem is when you grow up to 48, then that's the last point or the best point to start with a new cluster, because then you can start with a few servers directly and can expand later also, and do not go and make your cluster complete full. That's a very important point.
Yeah, so one of the things which is always very, very challenging in a service provider or multi-tenant environment from an operations perspective is you don't want to run out of resources. Customers don't care how you solve your resource problems. It's your problem, because that's why you are the service provider. They don't go to a service provider if they want to manage all of that themselves. So that is one of the reasons where you need to be very careful. And then the easiest approach for anyone who has never worked with VCD is typically to come up as like, why don't I just actually take that customer and spread that across 2 different clusters? Yes, you can do that, but we will come in a few minutes to the point where we talk about the concepts of VDCs and stuff like that within Cloud Director, and that will make very, very clear that it's not that easy, because all of a sudden your customer would have to always decide where to put workloads. They can't easily move them around anymore. Network connectivity gets complex and everything else. That's why we always say is like every cluster should maximally sized for 75% of the capacity, so that you always have 25% capacity bare minimum left, because that gives you headroom, worst case, to throw more hosts and other things at it and actually solve any immediate resource issues until you actually outgrow it or start moving customers. A few other things we have in this whole game is distributed switches. We clearly need them. We don't need to discuss that anymore. As of the newest vSphere with NSXT, etc. releases, we can still work with standard switches, but it's more or less a must-have nowadays. The other things we need to cover is storage. It really doesn't matter if it's traditional storage or vSAN storage. Something we never ever want to see that anyone would implement it that way or design it for it is the star any storage profile. Do you know why?
Yes, sure. No, the problem is when we are going with star any profiles, we have the problem that Cloud Director also uses the local storage on the ESXi host. And that is a really big problem. When we have an outage on this ESXi host, or we need to migrate it. So we can't migrate, we can't migrate virtual machines, but we can start it if we have the outage of the ESX host.
Yeah, so just to make that clear, there are ways to block that, but if you ever, and that's, by the way, one of the default values. So default, if you create a new VDC, it will automatically throw star any in there, and you don't want to have that happen. So there are a few things where you need to be very, very, very careful. After the session, you can go back there, and they potentially have gifts for you. Let's see if that works. No, so think about these. There are clear advantages of using vSAN because that gives you the capability to have multiple policies. So there are multiple ways on how to solve this, but think your storage scenario completely through as you design a VCD infrastructure, not only the storage profile. How are you going to, for example, charge for your customer? Are you going to charge them per gigabyte? How are we going to deal with IOPS per gigabyte or anything like that? So there are tons of different scenarios you think through. And in the end, all of what we design here needs to be something which your end customers are going to buy, which is the other big mistake most service providers do is like they come up with a highly intelligent technology solution. And they have never spoken to any of their salespeople if that is anything what their customers need. And we had service providers in the US where after 1 year we had to come in and actually build a new business model because they had over 100 hosts sitting around and doing nothing because the technology people thought they have the most clever idea on what their end customers needed and never spoke to any of the front-end people from a sales perspective. Moving along, so we have now a rough idea on how our vSphere infrastructure and everything else should look like. Next is we need to go down within VCD and basically decide what we need to do.
Yes, the first point we have to do is to create a provider VDC. So that means we need to create a provider VDC. So we say this cluster is part of our provider VDC. And the important point here, when we create a provider VDC, we have to select what network do we want to use. So we have to go with NSXT when we create a new one. The old ones we had done with NSXV. And an important point here, we can change it afterwards. So
you can't.
Can't. Yeah. Sorry. And that is an important point. So when you create a cluster or you have a cluster with NSXV, you cannot change it to NSXT. You have to create a new cluster with NSXT or a new provider VDC with NSXT and then go or move your complete tenants to the new provider VDC. And that is an important point from the design perspective. to think about this?
Yeah, the next thing is once it comes down to organization VDCs, organization VDCs by themselves are not necessarily that complex. Those who are not familiar with the VCD concepts in general, an organization is what you would consider a client or a tenant or something like that. And each client or tenant gets an organization VDC assigned. An organization VDC, when you create it, is going to ask you which allocation model you are going to use. If you do that, you have basically 4 options directly ahead of you. Reality is you actually have 6 options. Some of them come by the fact whether you allow elastic mode or not on the provider VDC or on the vCenter level. So you need to fully understand what the consequences of these allocation models are. Why? Because we strongly suggest to not mix allocation models on the same physical cluster. Not because it's technically not working. It becomes really a pain to troubleshoot any performance issues of your customers if you are going to mix your allocation models there. So if you have any business demand to have 3 or 4 allocation models, you will more or less get us in a design scenario that we are going to explain you, then you will have 3 or 4 different clusters. Trust me, that leads in most service provider cases to the point that we get it down to 2 maximum. But it's really important to do that. Again, technology-wise, it works perfectly well. It works exactly as it is designed. But I have been there often enough to troubleshoot performance on a customer who says my VM is very slow, and the service provider had no clue, because the challenge is all of these allocation models have different behaviors in regards to whether performance settings are done on a resource pool basis, on a per VM basis, on a combination of both of them, and all of that can be very, very hard to troubleshoot from a performance perspective. Plus, even if you have figured out what's wrong, the biggest problem you have is you can't immediately change it. You cannot make any changes to resource assignments on the vCenter side. If you do that, VCD is going to come around after a few minutes and actually revert your settings, no matter what you do, if it even takes a few minutes. So that's not going to help you. The other thing which is going to happen, you then go back into VCD and make the changes there. But if it's some of the allocation models, these changes will only be applied if the VMs of that complete vApp are going to be powered off. So you now have to make a call to your customers already pretty mad at you because his VM doesn't actually operate perfectly well. Potentially has created a vApp with 50 VMs in there, and now what you have to explain to that customer is, hey, take these 50 VMs, power them all off, and then I'm going to make the changes, and then you can power them on again, and then most likely performance is going to be good. So this is something you want to avoid. So this is why it's very, very important to have the org model or the allocation models properly set up.
Yeah, the next point is the organization settings. When we create an organization, be careful with the default settings, because the most important point here from my perspective is the lease time. So when you start a new customer, you start the first virtual machine, and by default, they will shut down after 7 days. So, and the customer calls you, hey, we have a problem, we can't connect, and the virtual machine is powered down or suspended. And yeah, what's
You power it on again.
Yeah, they power it on again, and we have the same problem 7 days later. And
but at least they figure it out fast enough, because what happens after another 7 days? It's going to be removed. So, and I saw a few people in here smiling. So that smile was clearly my own experience, I'm pretty sure. It's like, and trust me, it's like, I'm not sure how many on any advisory boards we said, it's like, that default setting should change.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure why it's so difficult, because I have not met any service provider who liked that default setting. But for whatever reason, most likely that developer is long gone or something like that, that can obviously not be changed, because everybody says it's like, who comes up with 7 days? But yeah, if you forget to change that, have fun. Your VM is going to first turn off after 7 days. If this is not an important VM of your customer and you have set some other weird settings, another 7 days, and then the storage cleanup will kick in. And now you have an even more interesting discussion with your customer, as we so far haven't implemented backup yet, because that was phase 2 of our implementation.
And that's very important, that you create a list for yourself, what to do when you create an organization, what settings you have to change.
Automated.
Automated, yeah.
Yeah. A few other things when we talk about networks, etc. Within VCD, one of the other confusing thing is people typically don't understand what an external network is. External network has nothing to do with internet or anything like that. It just means for VCD, this network is managed externally. VCD does not control, manage, or do anything about this network. It just consumes it. It's very, very important to get that into your head because many people are confused by this term and based on that actually take wrong design decisions. Anything else, you can have OVDC networks, you can have VApp networks. They can be either routed, isolated, NATed, so you can basically build everything. Trust me, I'm doing VCD now. I looked it up the other day, over 10 years. There is, over all these 10 years, I have not come across any real life scenario which we couldn't build with VCD network from their network perspective. I'm saying real life scenario because sometimes people just come up with crazy stuff for the fun of it and which has nothing to do with what you really need in production. Then you sometimes have to do a more serious discussion around how this works. On the other hand, services it's going to be provider or tenant managed. So within VCD, especially over the last few years, a lot of the settings, even though it's not obvious, can now be set up in a way that it's either service provider or tenant managed. But somehow they forgot to put that in the user interface here. So you need to make a few API calls and a few JSON files and other things to actually modify some of these permissions, which is weird because 80% of the permissions can be changed in the UI. But there is another 20%, which is interestingly enough somewhere else. And by the way, forget that someone wrote documentation about that. Some of that is not even documented. So have fun of trying to figure out how all of that works. But the APA is somehow self-documented. I mean, Matthias typically says good code documents itself. That seems to be exactly the case for some of these pieces. So some of the other services you will have to think about from a design perspective. How are we going to deal with the firewalling from the outside? Do you have an external perimeter firewall? How do we route traffic through? How do you deal with overlapping networks and things like that? Overall routing is an important thing. What do we do with VPN? IDS, IPS, are you going to offer any of these services? Are you going to use distributed firewalls? All of these are design decisions which you should actually figure out for yourself before you start implementing. You should have an idea on how you design all of that in the end, because if you just start implementing it, especially now with NSXT, some of these impact on how we are going to design tier 0, tier 1, VRF, and everything else. That has changed with NSXT. NSXV was a lot more easier to manage. However, we didn't have so many options. And the performance was not as big.
Not only to manage, to design. The problem is with NSXT is the design. So we have to make clear what way the customer want to go. So we can go with a dedicated tier 0, we can go with a shared tier 0, and we can go with VRF. And that is a design decision you have to do before you start to create the customer network or the tenant. And yeah.
Good. A few other things which you have to consider, and we need to be a bit careful of time, I just figured out. Whether you're going to do a dedicated edge cluster. Dedicated edge cluster can now be two different ways. Dedicated edge cluster can be the dedicated edge cluster from an NSX perspective, but also whether we really have a hardware NSX or a hardware edge cluster, which we just set up so that all the NSX edge clusters come on top of that. I'm still not sure whoever came up with a crazy idea to call two things cluster which are not directly related to each other. But those are the things where you need to take a very close look into it. Other things is one of the most important questions I always ask in nearly every design project is like, how do you envision that your customers actually get the workload in? And trust me, how often I have been sitting in meetings and people looked at me as like, so what do you mean? It's like, yeah, so we now have a wonderful cloud, but how does your customer get the workload in? This is something you need to solve. And I have heard all kinds of weird answers to that. The best one I lately had was, yeah, the customer can actually export their VM into an OVF. They can put that on a hard disk, send it to us, and we are going to import that. And I was like, So how many days of downtime are you actually expecting your customers going to accept? Do you really think this is nowadays in 2022? Excuse me, it's 2022. Is that still a viable option? No, it's not. And whether you are going to use VCDA, there are other tools. I'm just using that because VMware has that out of the box. And you basically, as long as you just use it for migration services, you don't have to spend any extra points on it. So that's the easiest option.
And start about thinking to use it from the beginning, from the first day. Because on many customer meetings, they say to us, yeah, VCDA, we want to have it, but we can integrate it later. So we first want to integrate or set up the first customers on the infrastructure, and then we are going forward to VCDA. No, we need it from the first day because it's the easiest way to migrate the customer to the Cloud Director.
Because what it means for the end customers, they just deploy an OVF in their local on-prem vSphere, and even if it's 6.5 or whatever. And from there on, they can replicate the VM in. And then at one point in time, either manually or per script or per automation, say, it's like, tonight I want to actually fail over or switch over the VMs. There are no even ways to use VCDA with a layer 2. So you can basically more or less get that out of the way. So very often, if you only can certainly migrate certain services and stuff like that, all of that is possible, and there are more features actually coming out of it. But there is something more, and that's really coming into your field, and you need to watch that clock for that. But the other thing which we see again and again, and I'm making my usual Tanzu intro, is that we think most service providers skip out on the Kubernetes Tanzu piece. And why do I think from a business perspective that it's important to cover that? Every time any of your salespeople or any time any one of you actually explains to a customer that you cannot immediately provision a Kubernetes cluster for their workloads, they are going to go back somewhere else. And at that second, in most cases, you become the legacy provider. You becoming the mainframe, if we would take it in all terms. They will not come back with a Kubernetes cluster to you. They are not going to ask twice. That's a reality which we have seen already in the US massively, and that is potentially a reality we are going to see here. And that is why we always say it's like, go start implementing CSE and Tanzu directly from the beginning, and now you have the pitch on why this is not complicated.
It's very easy to deploy CSE and working with Tanzu when you have the Cloud Director. So what do you have to do? You need NSXT installed, but we have 2022, and you should have NSXT, or at least one cloud or one provider VDC with NSXT running now. Then we need NSX ALB. So it's an easy deployment. So deploy NSX ALB, connected with Cloud Director. Then we have to create a virtual machine where we can run the CSE software. So that's, for example, in Photon OS. There we deploy the CSE software, install it, and as this is running, we create a user in the Cloud Director. We connect the CSE server to Cloud Director. That's the permissions. And then we can start from the provider view and also from the customer view with a plugin, the Kubernetes plugin, and say, hey, I want to create a new Kubernetes cluster. They ask me how many master nodes, how many worker nodes. I have to give a name. I have to configure a name for the persistent volumes. And then as they start, and they will deploy me my Kubernetes cluster. It takes around about 10 minutes, and then the customer has their first Kubernetes cluster and can work with it. I can select it, can say, hey, give me my kube config, and I can connect to this cluster. And so, the last 10 seconds, try it out. If you have questions, come to us. We done this CSE installations currently 1 per week, roundabout, on service providers worldwide. And it's important that you start it.
And by the way, I have the wrong picture here. but Matthias had to leave this morning early. So, Time is over. Thank you all for being here. If you have any further questions, ping us. Beside the session, there is also Harold from us here. Fabian is here. If you have any questions, or ping us on any of the social media. And with that being said, thank you for being here. Enjoy the remaining 1 to 3 hours you are going to stay here, and hope to see you again next year. Thank you.